On behalf of Akuno Senko for Bay, you know what I'm saying? Jay, where you at? We're trying to help our people elevate. Hope. Hope. We're giving them hope. We doing what we gotta do, you know. Every day, one step at a time, man. We gonna make it happen. Helping our people elevate. Yeah. Sometimes I practice focus, thought, and meditate. I'm trying to come with other ways to help our people elevate and seeking knowledge, make me levitate. The lifted mental state is what results from how we orchestrate. This for the family's sake. Let's self-reflect and self-evaluate. And every day, make sure the steps you take, you calculate. Receive a master's fate. I know I can't exist without the hate, but that's okay. I balance that with higher self today. Success is on this way, and after that, my flesh can pass away.
Peace, family. I want to say I appreciate y'all for checking out this content. You know what I mean? I want to appreciate y'all that watched that last video. Got over 200 views in 2 days. I also want to say to all returning subscribers, I appreciate y'all. To anyone that's new to this platform, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I appreciate you. I'm 10 subscribers away from 200 subscribers. So like I said, I just started this platform in May, mid of May. I'm 3 months in, and I appreciate the love that I'm getting for this information that I'm presenting to y'all. And so today's topic, I want to go over 2 topics, but I'm going to make the first one short. The first one, I want to connect the Moors to the indigenous people, or the so-called Native Americans or so-called Indians on this soil. But the topic we're going to discuss is the Native American Wars, which was a 313-year war from 1609 to 1924. But I'm not going to go through all the wars. I'm going to just give you the beginning time frame and let you see what kind of led up into or what happened during this time frame. And also, as I said, to 1924. And so if you watch the last video, you'll see where we had the so-called Black towns before the Great Depression. And the Great Depression started in the 1930s. And so you will understand, or you can connect these dots on what took place, how it all happened, and why it happened. So let's get right into it. And I want to start with this Africans Came Before Columbus that was published in October 21st, 2017 by this brother right here by the name of Dwayne Johnson. He says, when you don't teach a people about their complete history and greatness, you make them incompetent and unable to fulfill the full potential and plan for their future as a culture. While we commend Christopher Columbus, or should we say Cristobal Colon, for sailing the seas in search of new land on Europe's behalf, he was not the first to make that journey. In fact, widely untaught evidence exists that Africans sailed to the Americas and settled centuries before Columbus. According to an American historian and linguistics, Leo Wiener of Harvard University, one of the strongest pieces of evidence to support the fact that Africans sailed to the Americas before Columbus was a journal entry from Christopher Columbus himself. In Wiener's book, Africans and the Discovery of America, he explained that Columbus noted in his journal that the Native Americans confirmed Black-skinned people had come from the southeast in boats, trading in gold-tipped spears. It was found also that the ratio of properties of gold, copper, and silver alloy were identical to the spears then being forged in African Ghana, or Guinea. Enormous Olmec head statues with African facial characteristics found throughout Central and South America support that Africans had settled in America long before its apparent discovery. Ranging up to 11.15 feet in height and weighing 30 to 40 tons, these statues generally depict helmeted Black men with large eyes, broad fleshly nose, and full lips. The first of these heads was discovered by explorer Jose Melgar in Veracruz in 1862. Melgar wrote that what astonished me was the Ethiopic type which it represents. I reflected that there had undoubtedly been Blacks in this country, The headpiece worn on these Olmec sculptures is related to a type of war helmet identified as connecting them to the Egyptian region Nubians. In truth, Africans began coming to America thousands of years before Columbus, and the evidence of their presence through systematically ignore mainstream and K through 12 education curriculums is overwhelming and undeniable. Even early Mexican scholars were convinced that the impact of the Black explorers of the New World was profound and enduring. One author, J.A. Villacorta, has written, "Any way you view it, Mexican civilization had its origins in Africa." Indian scholar Rafik Jaraboz appears to have been right when he wrote, "The Black began his career in America not as slaves but as masters." It is about time that America realized this fact. And so this was written by this brother, Dwayne Johnson. And then I want to show y'all some images of the Olmec people and the people of Easter Island and these statues that were found. And so it says, wait, were the Olmec and Easter Island heads wearing fezzes? And I'm sure you're aware of the Moorish fez. If you're not, then I'll have the fez pop up. You'll see it on the screen right about now. And so as you see, the Easter Island heads, all these ancient images with these Moorish fezzes on their head. Now, I want to get into these wars. It started in 1609 and ended in 1924. But we're going to talk about the Jamestown Massacre, the Pequot War, the Beaver Wars, the King Philip Wars, the Pueblo Revolt, King William Wars, the Schenectady Massacre, and Queen Anne's Wars. So we're going to start with the Indian Massacre of 1622. And also, I want to touch on before we go in depth, but a lot of what I'm going to read to y'all, if y'all remember the cartoon Pocahontas, there's a lot of key pointers. It's going to mention her in this. And also, when they said in the cartoon, we're going to name the town Jamestown after our king. Well, where did slavery take place? Jamestown, Virginia. And so we're going to get into it. The Indian Massacre of 1622 was an attack on the settlement of the Virginia colonies by the tribes of the Powhatan Confederacy under their leader, Opchacanoe, of 1554-1646, and his brother, Opitachapam, resulting in the death of 347 colonists. Y'all gonna hear me saying these names a few times, but I can't say these names properly, so don't judge me. I'll make sure that you see it, or I'll have something put up so you can recognize it. It says, resulting in the death of 347 colonists. Credit for its success is always given to Opchacanoe, with Opitachapam playing a secondary role. The attack was carefully planned and carried out with such speed and precision that only one settlement, Jamestown, received warning and was able to prepare a defense. Out of approximately 1,250 English colonists, 347 were killed, and on March 22nd, 1622, mostly before noon, and hundreds more would die in the following months from malnutrition, starvation, and disease due to the destruction of their crops, as well as further periodic engagements with natives. The attack was a complete surprise and total military victory for the Powhatan Confederacy. Peace had been established between the colonists and natives since the end of the First Powhatan War in 1614. Natives and colonists partnered in trade, visited each other's settlements, and natives were also often guests in colonists' homes. Since 1610, however, the colonists had begun to spread out from their initial settlements of Jamestown, taking more and more land from the Powhatan Confederacy, abusing their land, stealing food, and allowing livestock to destroy crops and desecrate sites sacred to native rituals. Canoe attacks had three objectives: demonstrate the military might of the Powhatan Confederacy, demoralize the English colonists, and encourage them to pack up and return to their country. The attack succeeded in the first two objectives, but instead of leaving the colonists entrenched and fought back in the Second Powhatan War of 1622 to 1626, which they won. Afterward, trade with certain tribes was discouraged and more land was taken for tobacco plantations. Canoe launched another offensive in 1644, setting off the Third Powhatan War of 1644 to 1646, which ended when he was taken captive and killed. Following the conflict, the Treaty of 1646 dissolved the Powhatan Confederacy and led to the reservation system for Native American tribes in the area. The 1622 massacre also influenced Anglo-Native relations elsewhere in the English colonies, contributing to English policies and military campaigns during the Paquet War of 1636-1638 and King Philip's War, 1675 to 1678, in New England, the development of laws concerning Native Americans afterwards. Let me go into the Jamestown and Powhatan Confederacy. The Jamestown colony of Virginia was established by the English in 1607 and fairly quickly came into conflict with the native tribes of the Powhatan Confederacy. These tribes had lived on the land which they knew as Chicanoma, densely populated land, for thousands of years, establishing cultural traditions linked to the area. The Spanish arrived in the West Indies in 1492 and then colonized South and Central America, extending their reach up through the modern-day state of Florida and laying further claims to the North America East Coast up to the present-day New York State. They had not colonized above Florida, however, and limited themselves to raid along the coast, kidnapping natives to sell into slavery. And so again, I mean, it just told you the Spanish arrived in 1492 and colonized South and Central America. Then it also said that they had not colonized above Florida, however, and limited themselves to raid along the coast, kidnapping natives to sell into slavery. And so I don't say nothing about us coming off no slave ships from Africa being sold here into slavery, but it does say that we were kidnapped over here and sold into slavery. It does say that. It says the English, who were late in their colonization efforts in the so-called New World, established their Roanoke colony in 1585 and again in 1587 in Virginia, but it did not survive past 1590. The natives, therefore, were already acquainted with Europeans by 1607, and experiences had been far from pleasant. The Powhatan Confederacy, led by Chief Powhatan, also known as Wahun Senaka, of 1547 to 1618, did not mind the English at first because they had chosen the swamps of unusable land for their settlement and further thought the English might serve as allies against the Spanish and other hostile tribes. Chief Powhatan therefore ordered his people to supply the ill-equipped and inept colonists with food and supplies. The colonists came to expect this type of service rather than learning to fend for themselves. Captain John Smith of 1580-1631 established a good working relationship with the chief Powhatan in 1607, but by 1609 was strained by the colonists' continued abuse of the natives through theft of land and food. Smith himself, in spite of his earlier efforts to befriend the tribes, eventually participated in food theft himself and left the colony for England in October 1609 without informing Chief Powhatan of his departure. After Smith was gone, the colonists took more food and occupied more land outside of Jamestown as they considered the natives to be subject of the English king as they were themselves. These actions led by Chief Powhatan to order them inside their settlement and to give his warriors leave to kill anyone found outside of this fortification. Powhatan's decree contributed to what is known as the starving times in Jamestown history, during which over 80% of the colonists died. In May of 1610, a new governor, Sir Thomas Gates, 1585-1622, arrived, and shortly after him, the aristocrat Thomas West de la Warr of 1577-1618. West rejected Smith's early approach in dealing with the natives and instituted a policy of no compromise, which set off the First Powhatan War, 1610-1614. A series of guerrilla strikes and counterstrikes, killing many on both sides. Then it goes into the Peace of Pocahontas. As I said, Pocahontas, the movie, all this ties into it. They put it in your face, they just don't teach you what it is that you're seeing. They don't tell you the truth about what it is that you're seeing. You got to do your own research, and then you'll be able to break the matrix or break this code. But it says, Peace of Pocahontas. The natives were better guerrilla fighters, and their weapons of the bow and arrow more effective than the colonists' muskets, which took more time to reload than it took a native archer to notch another arrow. The colonists, however, had a seemingly infinite supply of people who kept arriving to replace those who had been killed, while tribes of the Confederacy lacked this luxury. The colonists also continually displaced the natives by attacking a village, killing the people, and fortifying it, thereby depriving native populations of land and resources they were using in the war and enlarging the buffer zone between English settlement and native villages. While the war raged on, more and more colonists arrived with more muskets and cannons, and settlements were established further inland. One of the colonists who had arrived in May of 1610 with Gates was John Rolfe of 1585-1622, who came with some hybrid tobacco seed, which he experimented with and planted. His tobacco became the most lucrative cash crop of the colony, and by 1614, he was a wealthy man with a large plantation across the river from the Henricus colony north of Jamestown. West fell ill in 1613 and returned to England after returning his authority over to Sir Samuel Agrell of 1580-1626, who continued his policies. That same year, Agrell kidnapped Pocahontas of 1596-1617, daughter of Chief Powhatan, holding her for ransom in Henricus. Chief Powhatan agreed to the terms of her release and sent Agrell the tools, weapons, and prisoners requested, but Agrell claimed he had not honored the deal and kept Pocahontas. She converted to Christianity, taking the name Rebecca, and married John Rolfe in April of 1614. Also, for you Bible thumpers, if you read the book or the story about Rebecca, it's talking about Pocahontas in the Bible. So look in your Bible, you'll see the story of Rebecca, and it's talking about Pocahontas. Let's say, okay, Chief Powhatan and the colonial authorities both approved of the union, and so ended the First Powhatan War. The 8 years that followed became known as the Peace of the Pocahontas, during which trade between the colonists and natives flourished, and land transactions were, for the most part, approved by both sides. That's what ended the First War in 1610. The beef started in 1609. War kicked off 1610. They kidnapped Pocahontas. She converted to Christianity, renamed her. They renamed her Rebecca, gave her a European name. She couldn't have that, her original name, her tribal name, so they gave her a European Christian name. And this is what led up to the massacre. Pocahontas, Rolfe, and their young son, Thomas Rolfe, of 1615 to 1680, left for England on a promotional tour to generate further investment in the colony in 1616. Pocahontas died in 1617 as they were on their way back to Virginia, and Thomas was left in the care of Rolfe's brother in England. Chief Powhatan kept the peace in honor of his grandson, but stepped down as chief shortly after his daughter's death. His brother, Aptichapelm, then became chief, but he was not powerful or popular among the tribes, as Chief Powhatan's half-brother, Aptichanu, became Chief Powhatan, and Wahansinaka died shortly afterwards, sometime in 1618. You'll see. Let me see y'all try to pronounce this shit. When Pocahontas had gone to England, Wahansinaka had sent along a number of her family and tribal members, including her brother-in-law, Tomokomo, who was also one of his sages and counselors. Tomokomo was to observe the English in their own land and return with a report according to colonial English accounts. Tomokomo criticized the English harshly before a council of the elders and chiefs, but was shamed into silence by a colonial delegation which countered his claims that the English could not be trusted. These accounts are suspect, however, as they were written by colonists who in fact could not be trusted, justifying later atrocities committed against the natives. Opachacano seemed to have accepted Tomokomo's words as the truth and planned accordingly. The Peace of Pocahontas still held in 1619, and the trade agreement had encouraged friendly relations between the immigrants and the indigenous tribes. In 1611, when Henricus had been established by Sir Thomas Dale of 1560 to 1619, the first college in North America was founded close by for the purpose of educating Native American youth in Christianity and European culture. Pocahontas' conversion had encouraged the hopes that more natives would follow her example, and more efforts was put into evangelizing the natives. Opticanus took advantage of these efforts, encouraging his people to show more interest in conversion, and he led by example in doing so himself, which led the colonists to believe further into the peaceful intentions of the tribes. The records of the Virginia Company, the group who had funded in 1607 Jamestown's expedition and still controlled the colony, made clear that in 1621, relations between colonists and natives were considered better than ever. The report written after the massacre describes the period leading up to it. As John Rolfe had remarried by this time and was back at his plantation, making regular trips across the river to Henricus. The House of Burgesses, first established in 1619, had made it their first order of business to address a wrong committed against Native Americans by a wealthy landowner. In 1621, Opticanu's war chief, Nemetenu, he died in 1621, was killed by the colonists after he was accused of killing one of their own and taking his clothes. Abchakanu took no action, claiming his men had been justly killed, though whether he meant this is debated, and letting the event go. So this is Damascus. So they had a peace. Pocahontas passed. They tried to get all of the natives to convert to Christianity. Some did. Then they ended up killing one of the natives because they accused him of killing one of the European colonists, and the chief said he justified it. So going to the massacre. At about the same time, he and his brother, Apchakampam, took war names in preparations for the attack and called on the tribes to participate in a ceremony honoring the life of Wahakasina. This event stirred up suspicion among the colonists at the time, but later they came to believe this was a pretense under the chief Powhatan was able to bring all the tribes together to coordinate the assault. At the time, it was later surmised the natives gathered intelligence on where certain colonists would be in various settlements, who would be working in the fields at what time, how long the full-scale attack would take to complete, etc. The morning of March 22nd, 1622, Good Friday began as any other, with the colonists going to work on their farms and in their shops. Scholar Charles C.M. describes the event which followed. Early that morning, Indians slept in the European settlements, knocking on doors and asking to be let in. Most were familiar visitors. They came unarmed. Many accepted a meal or a drink. They then seized whatever implements came to hand, kitchen knife, heavy stew pot, the colonists' own guns, and killed everyone in the house. The assault was brutal, widespread, and well planned. So swift were the blows that many colonists died without knowing they were under attack. Entire families fell. Houses burned across what had been Shimakoko Moko, I can't say it. At the last minute, several Indians told English friends about the attack, providing enough warning to let Jamestown gather its defense. Nonetheless, the attackers killed at least 325 people. So that's what the scholar Charles C. Mans, that's how he described the attack. As it said, that the natives and the colonists were associates at one time, they were friends at one time. So as it said earlier, that you would see the natives and colonists' homes. And so when they knocked on the door, hey, what's up, partner? Let me in. They thought it was all cool. They let them in, no problem. Even fed them, gave them something to drink. Gotcha. It says the number killed is hard to determine, but is usually given as 347. The college hospital and colony of Henricus was completely destroyed and all the inhabitants killed, including presumably John Rolfe. Settlements burned all across the region, and the surviving colonists were stunned into inaction. They had grown used to small conflicts breaking out, which were quickly resolved. None of them could conceive of what they had just experienced. The aftermath and response. At this point, Apchaknakana could have easily finished the survivors off. Those outside of Jamestown would have been easily enough to kill, as they had no defenses, and Jamestown could have been set on fire with fleeing colonists, then killed as they tried to escape. Instead, he did nothing but wait for a response. It was his hope that this response would take the form of the colonist's swift departure from his lands, which he believed what was a Native American tribe would do, but he had misjudged this opponent. The colonists began to regroup and rebuild and traded again with the tribes that had attacked them. They actually had little choice, however, as their own crops had been burned. Man's comments. So this is the Charles May comments, the scholar. The aftermath of the massacre claimed as many as 700 more lives. Because the attack disrupted spring planting, the colonists grew even less maize than usual. Meanwhile, the Virginia Company tried to rebuild Jamestown by sending over 1,000 new colonists. Incredibly, they came to Virginia with no food supplies. Reinforcements could not help against the guerrilla tactics of the natives in the Second Powhatan War, however, and so the colonists resorted to trickery. They called for a peace conference at which they poisoned the wine, and once the chiefs had fallen, attacked their bodyguards and attendants, killing over 200 of them. The war continued until Opticanoo sued for peace in 1626, but hostiles went on through 1629 and in 1630 in some areas. I keep reading, but I'm going to the next. Going to the Pequot Wars of 1637. Pequot Wars, or the Pequot. Let's explain who the Pequot were. The Pequot were any member of a group of the Algonquin-speaking North American Indians who lived in the Thames Valley and now what is known as Connecticut. U.S. Their subsistence was based on the cultivation of corn, hunting, and fishing. In the 1600s, their population was estimated to be about 220,000 individuals. The Mohegan and the Pequot were joined rudely by the Pequot chief Sassacus until the rebellion of their sub-chief Uncas resulted in Mohegan independence. For a period from 1620 onward, the Pequot and British settlers lived side by side in mutual happiness and peaceful trade. Gradually, however, Pequot resentment swelled as increasing numbers of colonists encroached upon tribes' customary territory. Pequot were concerned regarding these intrusions because their territories had already been reduced to the regions between Narragansett Bay and the Connecticut River. The Pequot eventually promised all tribal trades to the Dutch, a course of action much resented by the British. Several incidents had taken place between the Pequot and the British colonizers by the summer of 1636, when matters came to a breaking point. At this time, a Boston trader was murdered, presumably by a Pequot, on Block Island. A punitive expedition that was sent by Massachusetts authorities to destroy native villages and crops succeeded only in arousing the tribes to make a more determined defense of its homeland. Puritan clergymen encouraged violence against the Pequot, whom they regarded as infidels, and the British colonists agreed to take up arms. The turning point in this vicious 11-month Pequot War followed was a mystic campaign of May 10th to the 26th of 1637, in which Captain John Mason led English, Mohegan, and Narragansett warriors in an attack on the main fortified Pequot village on the sites of modern-day Mystic, Connecticut. Okay, this is in Connecticut. The Pequot were surprised but quickly mounted a spirited defense that almost led to an English defeat. Realizing that he could not defeat the Pequot in that close quarters of the palisade, Mason ordered their wigwams set afire. Some 400 Pequot men, women, and children were burned alive and slaughtered when they tried to escape. After the Pequot were defeated in the subsequent Battle of English Withdrawal and in the swamp fight, most Pequot communities elected to abandon their country rather than continue the war against the English. Many who fled were killed or captured by other tribes or the English, and others were sold into slavery in New England and the West Indies. The remainder were distributed among others tribes, where they received such harsh treatment that in 1655 they were placed under the direct control of the colonial government, resettled on the Mystic River. The English claimed all the Pequot territory by right of conquest. And so I'm gonna just make this one quick. I ain't gonna go too deep with this one. But as you heard in this one, that the Englishmen, this took place in Connecticut in the 1600s. And the Englishmen would use tribes to attack other tribes. And so that's the Pequot. Then we go into the Great Beaver Wars by Nick Evans. And the Great Beaver Wars was in 1640s in Ohio. And so starting in 1640, there was an intermittent war fought over one of the most in demand, luxurious items in the world, beaver pelt. The war was fought between the Iroquois Confederacy of the St. Lawrence River area of the Algonquin-speaking tribes of the Ohio County and the Great Lakes, who were backed by the French. These wars took place in the Great Lake region. It says the Iroquois Confederacy was made up of 5 tribes that all spoke the Iroquois language: the Mohawk, Oneida, Oneida, however you say that, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. These tribes were involved in the fur trade for over 200 years prior to the war. The Iroquois traded beaver pelts to British settlers and merchants. In return, the Iroquois received items that they depended on, such as tools and firearms. By the mid-17th century, the Iroquois had hunted the beaver to near depletion in the St. Lawrence River area. Needing beaver pelts to trade for much-needed items, the Iroquois expanded their hunting to the Ohio County. When they did this, the Iroquois ran into other tribes in the region who also traded beaver fur. These tribes included the Algonquin-speaking tribes such as the Lenape and the Delaware, and the French merchants that supported them. This accidental meeting led to a series of battle and bitter rivalries that lasted over 60 years. Each side was trying to be the main supplier in the lucrative beaver pelt trade. Although the Iroquois Confederacy could not be considered victors as they conquered most of the Ohio County, they too suffered and lost much in the process. Iroquois homes and agricultural land were often burnt down by the French. Again, us putting our faith into these colonizers, they use us against each other while tearing us down. In 1701, the Treaty of Grand Paix was signed by the British, the French, the Iroquois Confederacy, and the tribes of the Great Lake. The treaty did not push the French out of the territory, but it did solidify an alliance between the Iroquois Confederacy and the British that would later help both in the French and Indian War. But it said the Beaver Wars played an integral part in establishing relations between American Indians and European settlers. So, I mean, that right there, I mean, yeah, because it talked about majority of the tribes and how this lasted for 200 years prior to the war. Between all these treaties with all these different tribes, multiple tribes siding with few European settlers, European colonists. Let's get into the King Philip's War of 1675 to 76. British Native American conflict. King Philip's War, also called the Great Narragansett War of 1675 to 1676 in British American colonial history, war that pitted Native Americans against English settlers and their Indian allies, that was one of the bloodiest conflicts per capita in U.S. history. Historians since the early 18th century, relying on accounts from the Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth colonies, have referred to the conflict as King Philip's War. Philip Sachem, chief of a Wampanoag band, I can't pronounce that word, was the son of Massaoitz. Y'all see the pictures, who had greeted the first colonists of New England at Plymouth in 1621. However, because of the central role in the conflict played by the Narragansetts, who composed the largest Native American group then in the southern New England, some historians refer to the conflict as the Great Narragansett War. So this Narragansett was the largest Native American tribe in the southern New England area that they were in this Massachusetts area. The war's proximate cause was Plymouth colony execution in June 1675 of 3 of Philip's warriors. They had been tried and found guilty of murdering John Sassaman, a Harvard-educated praying Indian convert to Puritanism, who had served as an interpreter and advisor to Philip, but whom Philip had accused of spying for the colonists. His murder ignited a tinderbox of tension between Indians and whites that had been smoldering for 55 years over competing land claims, including disputes over the grazing of colonial livestock on hunting and fishing grounds, interracial insensitivities, and English cultural encroachment on Native Americans. That was the case even with the somewhat intertwined Native American English economy and the conversion of Christianity by some Indians. And so, yeah, by the 1600s, late 1600s, almost to the 17th century, a lot of Native American tribes converted over to Christianity. Over the next 6 months, colonial militia and Native Americans raiding parties ranged over modern-day Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and even coastal Maine. Although the Narragansetts had attempted to stay neutral, individual Narragansett warriors had participated clandestinely in raids on colonial strongholds and militia. Soon colonial leaders deemed the Narragansetts in violation of a series of peace treaties, leading the United Colonies of Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Connecticut to amass the largest colonial army assembled to date in New England, consisting of 1,000 militia and some 150 Indian allies. In November 1625, Governor Josiah Winslow of Plymouth Colony marshaled the colonial militia and rendezvoused in Rhode Island territory. The objective was to attack the Narragansett before they could muster a spring offense. The militia burned abandoned Indian villages along the way. Beginning on the morning of December 19th, during a bitterly cold snowstorm, the militia and its Indian allies began their attack on the Narragansett's main fort, situated on the island amid a frozen swamp in what is now West Kingston, Rhode Island. An attack henceforth known as the Great Swamp Fight. By evening, the militia had overrun the fort and began burning the homes and food supplies of the Indian defenders. Although determining numbers of casualties is always difficult, perhaps some 150 Indian inhabitants, many of them women and children and the elderly, were killed and burned alive. Others escaped across the swamp, though many of them then died from exposure. The militia suffered about 70 dead and 150 wounded, some of whom died from their wounds. In the wake of the attack, the ensuing slaughter, the Narragansets wholeheartedly joined the anti-English war efforts, albeit in a weakened state. Meanwhile, raid by the English allied Mohawks damaged Philip's diplomatic entreaties to expand the conflict by enlisting other regional Indian groups. A colonial expedition after the Great Swamp Fight had some success, but did not end the conflict. The Indian coalition, having came under the leadership of the Narragansett Sachem Kenosha, then embarked on a late winter offensive in 1607 that published back most of the colonial frontier in the Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Rhode Island colonies. In fact, much of the war's extraordinary damage occurred during the phase of the conflict. The Narragansetts, for example, destroyed all white settlements in Rhode Island on the western side of the bay, including Providence, which they burned in March of 1676. In the end, however, Native American opposition in Rhode Island was eradicated, and nearly all of the colony was opened to white settlement. Connecticut claimed most of the southern parts of the colony by right of conquest of having defeated the Narragansetts. By the late spring of 1676, other colonies began to follow the Connecticut's lead by incorporating friendly Indians into their forces. Benjamin's Church's Plymouth Command, a non-Connecticut exception, had utilized Indian allies since the beginning of the war, and he succeeded in killing Phillips in August of 1676. By September, the colonists and their Indian allies had destroyed much of the Native American oppositions in southern New England, killing thousands of Native Americans and selling many into slavery and indentured servitude. Some 600 English soldiers had been killed in the conflict and 17 white settlements destroyed. Some 50 additional settlements had been damaged. Only Connecticut emerged unscathed from the conflict because of its unique relationship with local Native American groups. And so I'm gonna end that part right there, just to show you how, again, they use these Native American tribes against other tribes. Same thing we do today. You see us fighting each other today while building their corporations, while building their businesses, while building their establishments. Then we go into the Pueblo Rebellion of 1680, the history of North America. The Pueblo Rebellion in 1680 carefully organized revolt of Pueblo Indians in league with Apache, who succeeded in the overthrowing Spanish rules in New Mexico for 12 years. A traditionally peaceful people, the Pueblos had endured much after New Mexico's colonization in 1598. Catholicism was forced on them by missionaries who burned their ceremonial pits, masks, and other sacred objects. Indians were tried in Spanish courts and received severe punishment by hanging, whipping, dismemberment of hands or feet, or condemnation of slavery. From 1645 on, there were several abortive revolts, after each of which medicine men were especially signaled out for reprisal. One medicine man, Pope of the San Juan Pueblo, embittered by imprisonment, believed himself commanded by the tribal ancestral spirits to restore the old customs. On August 10, 1680, he led a full-scale revolt in which among the Pueblos participated. On August 21st, the Spaniards were forced to flee, leaving 400 dead, including 21 priests. The Indians celebrated their victory by washing off the stains of Christian baptism, annulling Christian marriages, and destroying churches. They remained free until 1692, when New Mexico was reconquered by Governor Pedro de Vargas. And so we go into the King William Wars, the history of North America. The King William Wars of 1689 to 1697, North American extension of the War of the Grand Alliance, waged by William III of Great Britain and the League of Augsburg against France under Louis XIV. And I talked about King Louis XIV in the whole Louisiana Purchase video I did. And so again, I haven't read this, but all this ties into each other. And I'm gonna put that video on after this video. So if you haven't seen that video, you can watch that one so you'll know about the war between Great Britain and King Louis. But it says, I'm gonna reread that. It was the American extension, the King William Wars, North American extension of the War of the Grand Alliance waged by William III of Great Britain and the League of Augsburg against France under Louis XIV. Canadian and New England colonists divided in support of their mother countries, and together with their respective Indian allies, assumed primary responsibility for their own defense. The British, led by Sir William Phillips, captured Port Royal, Acadia, later known as Nova Scotia, but failed to take Quebec. The French and Indian under the Count de Frontenac carried out successful attacks on Cincinnati in New York, Salmon Falls, in present New Hampshire, and Costco Bay in present Maine, but failed against their main target, Boston. The protracted war ended with the Treaty of Ridgewick in 1697. Because of the importance of Indian participation, it is also known as the first of 4 French and Indian Wars. Then we go into the history of the Mohawk Valley, the Schenectady Wars. On the night of Saturday, February 8th, 1690, a war party of Canadian, French, and Indian burned Schenectady, massacred 60 of its people, and carried 27 of them into captivity. This gory beginning of King William's War in the province of New York constitutes one of the most terrible chapters of early state history. The French governors of Canada had many times advocated the conquest of New York. In 1689, de Caleris, the governor of Montreal, wrote to France a detailed plan for the invasion of the province. Louis XIV was impressed by this project, which was made in great detail. Accordingly, he sent Count de Frontenac to carry out the great scheme and furnished him with instructions fully as completed in their scope as the plan suggested by de Caleris, how do you pronounce it? I don't know these people's name back then. But Louis, however, gave a touch of a true despot when he added to the military plan to involving the expiration of particularly all the 18,000 people of New York who were to be sent out of the colony into those adjoining. Even the New York Catholics were to be considered not above suspicion. By the side of the grandiose plan of Louis XIV for the elimination of the people of New York, the later expulsion of the French from Acadia was a small affair. 1,600 French soldiers were ordered to Chattahoochee Harbor in Acadia. The project was for Frontenac to invade New York by way of Richelieu River and Lake Champlain in cooperation with the force which was to operate from Acadia. The plan of campaign was, in a general way, similar to made by the Burgoyne for the reduction of New York in 1777. The troop ships were late in starting, and when they reached Chattahoochee, the seasons were too far gone to start the grand project of conquest. Frontenac was a man of action, and he realized that something must be done to restore the prestige of New France, so recently devastated and laid low by the Iroquois invasion of 1689. Accordingly, the wily French viceroy launched 3 midwinter expeditions against the frontiers of the English colonies. The first war party went from the Montreal against Albany, but the weakness of the troops made its leader change their objective from Albany to Skinati, or Collier, as they called the latter village in honor of Van Collier, its founder. Here the Canadians invaders burned the town and massacred its people, as related later. The second party went from the Three Rivers into New Hampshire and fell upon the sleeping village of Salmon Falls, where it slaughtered and burned much as the first party did at Skineti. The third Canadian, French, and Indian party from Quebec joined the second, and together they attacked the New England fort at Casco Bay. The defender made a strong resistance, but finally surrendered when promised protection from the savages. The pledge was not kept, and Portneuf, the French commander, handed over his captives to the scalping knives and tortures of his barbarian allies. This foul deed formed one of the several black stains on the military records of the usually gallant commanders of New France. The Acro cities of Frontenac border warfare impressed the Indians, and wavering northwestern tribes hasted to ally themselves with the strong old men of Canada. By contrast, the English colonies were filled with horror as the unspeakable barbarities of the supposedly civilized people who waged a savage war as their red allies. The Americans swore vengeance, resolving to unite and crush common enemies. The colonists would never conduct hostiles in the manner of these expeditions on Frontenac, as they realized the two people with such differing ideas of humanity could not long endure upon the same continent. And so, yeah, I mean, they just were going around murdering, slaughtering, burning people throughout the 1600s and using our own people against us. We have the Queen Anne Wars. Queen Anne Wars of 1702 to 1713, second in a series of wars fought between Great Britain and France in North America for control over the continent. It was the contemporaneous with the War of the Spanish Succession in Europe. The British military aid to the colonists was devoted mainly to defense of the area around Charleston, South Carolina, and the exposed New York, New England frontier with Canada. English settlements were subject to brutal raids by French forces and their Indian allies. After the British captured of the key French fortress of Port Royal in 1710, French-ruled Acadia became the British province of Nova Scotia. In addition, under the terms of the Treaty of Utrecht 1713, Britain acquired a newfound land and the Hudson Bay region from France. And so just a quick on the Queen Anne's War was a war between Great Britain and France and the Native American allies to help them take over Charleston, South Carolina. And New York, the exposed parts of New York, New England. New York became the New England. And within that Treaty of Utrecht of 1713, Britain acquired newfound land in the Hudson Bay region from France. I also want to touch on the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. The Sand Creek Massacre, also called Shivington Massacre, November 29th of 1864, controversial surprise attack upon a camp of Cheyenne and Arapaho people in southern Colorado territory by a force of about 675 United States troops, mostly Colorado volunteers, under Colonel John M. Shivington, under Colonel John M. Shivington. The camp contained approximately 750 Cheyenne and Arapaho following the eruption of hostiles between the Army and Indian Black Kettle. White Antelope and some 30 other Cheyenne and Arapaho chiefs and headmen had brought their people as friendly Indians to the plains, to the site along the Sand Creek near Fort Lyon, and according with instructions issued by Colorado Territory Governor John Evan, to report to their nearest Indian agent. Although they were unarmed, the Cheyenne and Arapaho were under a white flag and truce when they were attacked by the Army. More than 230 Native Americans were massacred, including some 150 women and children and elderly. 13 Cheyenne chiefs and one Arapaho chief were killed. Shivington was first acclaimed for his victory, but he was subsequently discredited when it became clear that he had perpetrated a massacre. The incident was a chief cause of the Arapaho-Cheyenne War that followed and had far-reaching influences on the Plain Wars of the next decade. The Sand Creek Massacre National Historical Site was opened in 2007 to preserve the location of the incident. Also, I want to touch on how they classified Africans and Indians under the status of Negro. And so it says, so now those Indians who decided to stay on their land were reclassified as Negroes. This was done also in Virginia, in Jamestown. This propagated the Indian Removal Act and reclassification, though other tactics were employed. The lynching of Jim Crow South enforced the reclassification from Indians to Black Americans. And so it tells you right there, we were classified as Negro. The Indians were reclassified as Negro and Black Americans. But as the image shows you, this is when this took place. Then we go into the Indian Removal Act, was signed by President Andrew Jackson of May 28, 1830, authorizing the president to grant unsettled land west of Mississippi in exchange for Indian land within existing state borders. A few tribes went peacefully, but many resisted the relocation policies. And so that goes into, you know, they call Oklahoma Indian territory. So a lot of the tribes, Trail of Tears, were forced this way. And then you had the Oklahoma Land Rush of 1889. And so 1830 was the Indian Removal Act. And then 69 years later is when they invaded Oklahoma. But between 1830 and 1850, about 100,000 American Indians living between Michigan, Louisiana, and Florida moved west after the U.S. government coerced treaties or used the U.S. Army against those resisting. Many were treated brutally, and estimated 3,500 Creeks died in Alabama and on their westward journey. And so, again, I'm connecting these dots, showing y'all we are these people that they call Black Indians or indigenous. This was our land. We were here first. We've always been here. We've never came from no slave ships. I just showed y'all that and all this information I just gave y'all. Again, if you're new to the channel, I want to say I appreciate you for watching. If you made it to the end of this, I want to say I appreciate you for listening. Peace and love. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. And we're going to catch you on the next one.